In October 2019, the remains of Francisco Franco, Spain's authoritarian ruler for nearly 40 years, were exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen. Originally buried in a vast basilica he had ordered built, his body was moved to a modest and private grave. This decision by the Spanish government reflected a desire to strip Franco of symbolic power and to close the chapter on a regime remembered for repression, censorship, and political violence. Yet Franco's role in 20th century Spain remains central to understanding the nation's modern history. But who was Francisco Franco? How did a career soldier rise from colonial wars in Morocco to rule Spain for nearly 40 years? And what is the true legacy of a man who left his nation divided long after his death? Francisco Franco was born in 1892 into a family of naval officers, but at a time when Spain's once great navy was shrinking, he turned instead to the army. His early service in Morocco, part of Spain's colonial wars, proved formative. He gained a reputation for discipline, conservatism, personal austerity, and being deeply religious, qualities that later shaped his political style. By the age of 19, he was already a lieutenant, and at 33, he became Europe's youngest brigadier general. In 1916, during fierce fighting in Morocco's Rif War, Francisco Franco led colonial troops against rebel forces. The campaign was brutal, and in one clash, he was struck by a bullet in the abdomen. The wound was grave, so grave that doctors feared he would not live. But against all odds, Franco survived. His recovery was slow but complete. He himself credited his survival to the protection of the Virgin Mary, a belief that would fuel his lifelong sense of divine mission. This episode changed not only Franco's faith but also his career. His conduct under fire and his reputation for discipline impressed his superiors and the crown. In recognition of his service and sacrifice, King Alfonso XIII decorated the young officer with the Cross of Maria Cristina First Class, marking him as a rising star in Spain's military establishment. That decoration was more than a medal. It was an early symbol of royal favor and a signal that Franco's destiny lay not just on the battlefield, but eventually in the politics of Spain itself. Franco's rise cannot be separated from the instability of early 20th century Europe. The 1929 financial crash in the United States reverberated globally, destabilizing economies and intensifying political polarization. In Spain, economic dislocation combined with a legacy of weak institutions and deep divisions between conservatives, monarchists, republicans, anarchists, and communists. Like other nations in interwar Europe, Spain became fertile ground for authoritarian solutions. Fascism offered the promise of national unity under a strong leader, while communism promised social equality. Both movements rejected liberal democracy, which many Spaniards associated with disorder and decline. By the early 1930s, Spain was in crisis. The monarchy had collapsed and was replaced by the Second Republic, which struggled to enact reforms in agriculture, labor, education, and church-state relations. As a result, polarization intensified. On the right, conservatives, monarchists, and the newly founded Falange Party rallied around hierarchy, Catholicism, and a strong state. On the left, Republicans, socialists, and communists demanded modernization and equality. The election of the Popular Front in 1936 triggered a military uprising. What began as a coup quickly escalated into the Spanish Civil War. The war lasted from 1936 to 1939. The conflict was catastrophic. Estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to 1 million, including not only combat casualties, but also civilian executions and atrocities committed by both sides. Spain quickly became a proxy battlefield for Europe. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy provided crucial support to Franco's nationalists, while the Soviet Union aided the Republicans. Although foreign powers vowed to stay out of the Spanish War, they supported soldiers and freedom fighters from across Europe. Some even came from as far away as the United States. Many were young, idealistic, full of exuberance, and had romantic ideas of Spain and the Europe of years past. Thousands of foreign volunteers, organized into international brigades, fought for the Republic. It was during this tumultuous time that Franco came to power. Francisco Franco was respected by many but cautious. At first he hesitated, but he joined the uprising in July 1936. The coup failed to take Spain outright. As the war dragged on, Franco proved to be the most capable leader among the rebels. He was careful, pragmatic, and skilled at uniting competing factions. Led by Franco, the monarchists, conservatives, and the fascist Falange all came under one banner. In 1937, he merged these groups into a single political party, the Falange Española Tradicionalista, giving himself supreme authority. Backed by Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, Franco's forces gained the upper hand. By 1939, the Republican government collapsed. Franco declared victory and assumed full control of Spain. His path into politics was therefore not through elections or ideology at first, but through war. Franco became a politician by necessity, a general who transformed into head of state by consolidating power during Spain's bloodiest conflict. Franco emerged as the leading figure of the nationalist cause. His regime was authoritarian, nationalist, and deeply conservative. Political opponents were imprisoned, executed, or exiled. Censorship and secret police suppressed dissent. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 200,000 people were executed during the first years of his rule, separate from the war's casualties. Yet Franco's foreign policy diverged from that of other fascist leaders. When World War II broke out later in 1939, many expected Spain to join the Axis powers in gratitude for German and Italian support. Hitler pressed for Spanish cooperation, especially for control of Gibraltar. But Franco, aware of Spain's exhaustion after the Civil War and the risks of another major conflict, maintained neutrality. He engaged in symbolic negotiations with Hitler, but ultimately withheld commitment. Hitler, frustrated, reportedly remarked that he would rather have his teeth pulled than negotiate further with Franco. Once in 1940, when Hitler visited him, Franco kept the Führer waiting for 2 hours while he enjoyed his afternoon siesta. With the neutral stance that he took, Franco allowed Allied soldiers shot down in France to travel through Spain onto Portugal and back to join the war. He strongly disagreed with Hitler over his treatment of the Jews. He even repeatedly asked Hitler to allow the Jews to leave Germany in peace. Franco went so far as to issue Spanish passports to German Jews so they could leave. Spain thus avoided direct involvement in World War II, though it remained diplomatically isolated in its aftermath. This isolation shaped Franco's post-war legacy. The United Nations excluded Spain from the newly formed organization, and Western democracies condemned his regime as a relic of fascism. Yet the onset of the Cold War altered perceptions. By the 1950s, Franco's staunch anti-communism made Spain a useful partner for the United States and its allies. Military and economic agreements gradually reintegrated Spain into the international community. Domestically, Franco imposed a vision of cultural and political uniformity. Castilian Spanish was declared the sole official language, with regional languages like Catalan and Basque restricted to private use. The Catholic Church regained its privileged position in education and public life. Traditional customs such as the flamenco dance and bullfighting were elevated as national symbols. However, women, under Franco's conservative gender policies, were relegated to domestic roles. Women were forbidden from having their own bank accounts separate from their fathers or husbands. They were not allowed to testify and couldn't be university professors. By the 1960s, Spain began to experience rapid economic growth, driven by tourism and foreign investment. This period, sometimes called the Spanish Miracle, contrasted sharply with the political stagnation of Franco's rule. The regime adapted cautiously, loosening some restrictions, but never permitting true political pluralism. Franco also sought to leave lasting monuments. Most notably, he commissioned the Basilica of Santa Cruz in the Valley of the Fallen. Officially framed as a memorial of reconciliation for those who died in the Civil War, it was built in part by forced labor from political prisoners and widely interpreted as a monument to the regime itself. In 1969, Franco named himself regent for life, but not even he could stave off illness and death. He is said to have suffered from Parkinson's disease in his later years. Before he died in 1975, he reinstalled the monarchy, even naming the exiled Prince Juan Carlos as his successor. Franco's rule has been described as both totalitarian and autocratic, but it was never centered around a personality. He believed that the state was more important than any one person. Franco himself continued to rule until his death on November 20th, 1975, after years of declining health. His passing opened the path to Spain's democratic transition, a process carefully managed by Juan Carlos and reformist leaders. Franco's legacy remains contested. Supporters emphasized the stability and economic growth of the later decades of his rule, while critics underlined the mass repression, cultural homogenization, and authoritarianism that defined his regime. Unlike Mussolini or Hitler, Franco did not seek foreign conquest. His dictatorship was more conservative than revolutionary, aiming to preserve hierarchy and tradition rather than to create a new social order. Yet it was no less repressive. His burial in the Valley of the Fallen long symbolized unresolved tensions in Spain's memory of the 20th century. The removal of his remains in 2019 reflected a broader effort to confront and redefine that legacy. It was a symbol that Spain has finally come to terms with its past and with the shadow of Francisco Franco.